A youth group choir from Texas had been invited by a preacher of a church up in Hudson, Massachusetts, to come up and sing for some of the area public high schools. I mean, he had heard them and was really enthralled with their music because they sang a bunch of fun songs. I mean, what he remembered most was that they had sung a performance of Gloria Estefan's song, The Rhythm Is Gonna Get You, and they'd used all sorts of whistles and other gadgets, and nobody later on could remember that they used the whistles, but that's what he remembered, and so he wanted to bring them up and be a part of a special time that he wanted to do for the community there. I mean, they called themselves something like Fresh Wind or High Notes or Aspire Higher. I mean, it was a name that was a long way from something that screamed, we're all about Jesus. And so he wanted to bring them in, go to these public high schools, which he did. I mean, they sang a bunch of Beach Boys songs, which, now this has been back in the 90s whenever they did this. Beach Boys go back before that, but if you remember back in the 90s, the song Kokomo and some of the other Beach Boys songs were really popular at the time. And so they came up and they sang those songs there in those high schools. They loved it in the high schools. The kids went crazy about it. Besides, they were from Texas, and people in the Northeast thought that was pretty cool. Well, the culmination of their visit happened in a Friday night concert that they were going to give. I mean, they called it the Pizza Blast. They were going to order pizza. They'd gotten T-shirts. They invited all these folks to come and be a part of this, both the kids and their parents. The mayor's daughter had talked about how excited she was. She loved them in the high school, and she was looking forward to that concert on Friday night. But they should have waited. I mean, everyone should have waited before getting too excited. I mean, after the opening up with some clean secular songs, this choir started slowly bringing in some God songs. I mean, it was completely unexpected. At this point, the preacher started getting sweaty. He could smell a bait and switch coming. I mean, how was he to know that the choir was going to shut all the doors in the auditorium and set up security guards and keep anyone from leaving? How was he to know they were going to put the church sleeper hold on the crowd and then give the altar call, expecting everyone to respond to Jesus that night? I mean, he couldn't. And then it hit the papers. I mean, people briefly hated the preacher and the church he was with. The mayor was horrified. The ACLU was called. Kids and parents alike probably were set back for about 18 months in their trust of God, of the church, of Christians, because churches have been known to use bait and switch too many times in the past. Churches oftentimes still are. And it's not that they intend to try to use trickery or to fool people. I mean, they truly want to attract people to Jesus, but sometimes they have a hard time knowing how to connect the core message of Jesus. I mean, Jesus died for you. He wants you to be his disciple, with making it relevant to a culture that's culturally blind. When we look at Jesus calling people to follow him, I mean, as he does today, his desire was for them to become disciples, to spend time with him, to get to know him, to listen to him, to learn from him, and then to be able to take the message of the kingdom of God that he was giving them and share it with others. But Jesus, even though he longed for people to join him and to be a part of his life, he refused to use any kind of bait and switch approach in his call. I mean, when he called people, he refused to represent discipleship as anything else than what it was. I mean, when Jesus called people to follow him, to be his disciples, it was a call to counting the cost. We're going to be in Luke chapter 14 for this session. In Luke 14, at this point, Jesus has become pretty popular with the crowds. I mean, we read in verse 25, as Luke begins this part of his story, he says, large crowds were traveling with Jesus. They had seen his miracles. They saw how he healed the sick, how he gave lame people their legs again. He taught with this unusual and captivating authority that the people were hungry for. And he showed love and compassion in ways that they didn't see in their other religious leaders. He had this celebrity status And more people wanted to be near him. They wanted to hear him. They wanted to see him. They wanted to be a part of what he was doing. I mean, any marketing manager who could get a hold of Jesus at that time would have told him to take full advantage of that. I mean, here he was, a popular person in the Jewish communities. And after all, he had a product to sell. He wanted to sell the kingdom of God, and he needed to make it as attractive as possible and to put it out there while he had this name recognition with the people. I mean, he had their rapt attention. He didn't need to try to get an audience. They were already there. He didn't try to get them to try to get them to listen to him. I mean, they were hanging on every word he was saying. And so these crowds are traveling with Jesus. Now, what Luke says is that they're following behind him, but they aren't coming after him. They're not ones that have become his disciples yet. And so Jesus turns and he speaks to them. He wants to talk to them about going deeper with him, not just being bystanders, not just being spectators. He truly wants them to be involved in his life. He wants them to become more than just curious, fascinated observers. Now, it's likely that Jesus spoke these words that we're about to read to other crowds besides just the one we're talking about here. I mean, the way Luke describes it, large crowds were following him. We know that he spoke these words at least one other time to crowds over in the book of Mark. We know that he spoke words similar to these to his disciples privately as he was getting them to go deeper in their discipleship with him. But what he was about to tell them would have driven those marketing managers that we talked about nuts. They would have driven them crazy. Notice what he says. He turns to the crowd. If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and you're not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, "This person began to build and wasn't able to finish." Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he's able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he's not, he'll send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. Jesus turns to the crowds, and he doesn't prepare them with the positive side of things before hitting them with what many would consider the negative message that he has for them, the bad news. I mean, he forthrightly and unequivocally lays out his case for discipleship. And he lets them know that if you're going to be his disciple, there is a cost to pay. And you need to count that cost. He lays out 4 conditions for anyone who would come after him and be his disciple. Notice the first one. If anyone comes to me, there in verse 26, and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters. He says, if you're going to come after me, you're going to be willing to hate your family. We live in a culture that puts a lot of value on family, don't we? I mean, we hire youth and family ministers in the church. We talk a lot about doing things for the children out in the community and in society. We put a lot of resources in schools. I mean, we value family. We value building up those families. It was even more so that way to this audience in Jesus' day. They loved family. And so this language of hating family would have been very offensive to them. I mean, even if they understood that Jesus was using exaggeration to get a point across, it would have been very offensive. Of course, the word hate here has a comparative force that Jesus is using. What he's saying is that if you desire something more than something else, let me put it a different way. What hate refers to is desiring something less than desiring something else. So he says in this strong word, and he uses it intentionally, he uses it unapologetically, it's designed to stop the crowds in their tracks and to truly think about and reflect on what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. He says, I have got to be above your relationship with your family. When it comes down to a choice, anytime it comes down to a choice, whether it's a choice between devotion and commitment to family or devotion and commitment to Jesus Christ, your devotion and commitment to Jesus Christ must win over family every single time. Jesus has got to be the priority, he says, above everything else in the home, even at the risk of experiencing rejection and pain because of that choice within the family. So if you want to come after me, you got to hate father, mother, wife, and children, brothers and sisters. And then he goes to the second condition. Yes, even their own life. If you're going to come after me, you must hate even your own life. I mean, in an earlier lesson in this series, we talked about Jesus' call of denying self. I mean, he talks about that there is this self about us, this life that we hold on to very dearly and very strongly. I mean, we might call it the self-life. And it's about possessiveness. It's about control. I mean, we want to have control over our lives. And so denying self, hating self, is about not just giving up things, like a person might give up something for Lent, or something might make a New Year's resolution to do something different in their life. No, it's a way of saying no to oneself, of saying no to one's hopes and one's ambitions, to one's goals, to one's likes and dislikes, to one's interests, if that means that in doing so you can get closer to Jesus Christ. Or if saying yes to one's ambitions or one's goals or one's likes and dislikes gets in the way of following Jesus Christ and being a disciple, then you're willing to get rid of those. It's that same comparative force for the word hate. It applies to self. I mean, at those times when a person is forced to choose devotion and commitment to self over loyalty to Jesus Christ, then Jesus Christ must win every single time. And Jesus let the crowd know that this idea of self-preservation, I mean, this idea that was given to us by God, it's natural, it's good. But that self-preservation must give way to preserving a relationship in discipleship to Jesus Christ. The decision for Jesus must be willing to be a decision for a loss of goals or ambitions or objectives, of likes and dislikes, even ultimately the result of loss of life due to persecution or hostility, if it's for the sake of Christ. Pretty strong words for someone who wants to be a disciple of Jesus. But he's not finished yet. Again, verse 26, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Jesus talks about carrying a cross, and it would not have been lost on these crowds. They were very familiar with the methods of Roman crucifixion in those days. How they would get the condemned man and they would place at least part of the cross beam on the cross. They would place it on his shoulders, and he would be required to carry that cross from the place where they start to the place of execution, oftentimes, usually in the middle of a very hostile, mocking, ridiculing crowd. They knew that scene all too often. Now, Jesus was speaking figuratively about that mocking and rejection that would come from following Jesus, from being his disciple, experiencing that kind of mocking and ridicule. Disciples of Jesus can expect being rejected by those who do not honor Christ. And with that rejection comes contempt and disdain, comes hatred, comes suffering, all the treatment that comes with those feelings and those attitudes. But when you think about Jesus, it's not just a figurative sense, it's also a literal sense. The word that he says, using for follow here, we've noticed that the word follow translates different Greek words along the way. This particular word, to follow, actually translates two Greek words. Erkomai opiso. It means to come after, in the sense of to follow after positionally or chronologically after the one who was leading. I mean, Jesus would soon follow that path that other condemned people had done to go to the place of execution. And Jesus says, you must be willing to follow after me along that path, to come after me, either in position or chronologically. You must come after me. Go down that same road if necessary. A disciple must be ready to face and accept such rejection and such suffering. And then he gives a fourth condition. As he does so, he tells two parables. Notice what he says in these parables. Verse 28, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. The first parable is that of building a tower, and there's two parts of it. First, there is the preparation. First, you're going to sit down and you're going to estimate the cost. Notice the economic language that he uses. Sit down and estimate, or some translations will compute the cost. He talks about the cost, how much it's going to cost, what the price tag is going to be, to see if you have enough money to complete it. So there's the preparation, but then there's the follow-through. Are you going to have enough to complete it? If you lay the foundation, you're not able to finish it, then something's going to happen. And this ridiculing that ought to come because you follow Christ will instead turn to a ridicule because you didn't follow through. You didn't count the cost. You didn't make sure that you were ready to build. The word that he uses for this person in verse 30, it's a word that Luke often uses in his gospel in a derisive way. That man, that person. Well, that person wasn't able to finish it. Then he gives a second parable. Suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he's able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? And if he's not able, he'll send a delegation, while the other is a still long way off and will ask for terms of peace. Again, there's two parts to the parable. There's preparation. He's going to sit down. He's going to consider. And then after there's the preparation of whether he thinks through whether or not he can fight this battle, then there's a recognition. Well, if he's not able, he'll send a delegation in order to seek terms of peace. There is the counting of the cost. There is the looking at the situation. There is the reality check, as it were. If I'm going to make this choice, will I be able to follow through? Many have looked at this, in fact, both parables in many ways, but especially the second one, where a person who must look at, am I going to continue my war with God? I mean, he's much stronger than I am. He's a much stronger opponent. And when I finally come to the conclusion that there is no way I can win against God's strength and God's power, then I'm going to seek peace with him above all else. That peaceful relationship. I'm going to try to become peaceful and have a right relationship with God. That seems to be the point of the illustration. And Jesus concludes with the words, in the same way, those who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciple. Now, the language Jesus uses here is very different from what he said to that rich young man we talked about a few sessions ago. You remember to that rich young man back in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus says, you must go and sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and then you can come follow me. Jesus doesn't use that language here. He doesn't say, go get rid of everything you have. No, what he says is, if you don't give up everything. Some translations translate it, if you don't renounce everything. In other words, you must be willing to give up right of ownership for the things that belong to you in order for them to become in the ownership of someone else, in this case, Jesus Christ. You must be willing to renounce everything you have in discipleship so that they can be put at the Master's disposal. It calls for ultimate commitment. It calls for ultimate follow-through. Following Jesus should not be taken lightly. And Jesus uses these 4 conditions in order to bring up the significance and the importance and the meaningfulness of what it means to become a disciple. Hate father, mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters. Hate your own life. Take up your cross. Be willing to go through that suffering and that rejection. Be willing to give up everything, to renounce everything as your own, to give it to the ownership of someone else. It's not a trivial matter. Are you willing to count the cost? Jesus lays out these 4 conditions for becoming a disciple. And the way he describes it is that even if one of these is neglected, you're not ready to truly be his disciple. Notice he uses a phrase, you cannot be my disciple. He actually mentions it 3 times in this passage. It applies to all 4 of these conditions. Notice he says, if you fear family disapproval or family rejection, then you cannot be my disciple. If you want to protect your own self-interests above all else, you cannot be my disciple. If you are unwilling to experience ridicule and hostility for the sake of Christ, you cannot be my disciple. If you're not willing to relinquish all things to Christ's ownership and use in your life, allowing him to control it, you cannot be my disciple. And the statement in verse 33, the last of the statements, is especially adamant because he uses what's known as a complex double negation. Big word, but it's emphasizing what he's saying. Notice he uses the negative twice. He says, in the same way, those who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciple. By using those 2 negative statements together, it emphasizes the importance of what he's talking about here. The decision for discipleship is huge. I mean, do we understand that? Do we understand what it means? Jesus wanted the crowds to consider it with their eyes wide open and with their options completely understood. He was unwilling to sugarcoat it. He was unwilling to cover it up somehow. He was not willing to give them a bait and switch. Here, let me offer this positive thing. Now let me tell you what's going to cost you. Jesus was not one who would give these great emotional appeals for people to follow him. I mean, he just laid it on the line to them. He wanted to get them to give careful consideration to the costs and the consequences for the disciples' actions and choices, and whether or not that person could be faithful to the task. Because he gives them a caution at the end. He's mentioned the cost, he's mentioned the consequence. Notice the caution, and here he tells another parable. Verse 34. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. Parables cause some problems for folks in trying to interpret it. I mean, salt's a seasoning. It's got certain chemical compounds, and in that day it could be used either as a seasoning or as a fertilizer or as a preservative. Sometimes it was used as a catalyst for burning fuel, such as animal dung. And he says if the salt loses its usefulness, then it's just thrown away. But how can salt lose its flavor? I mean, it is a chemical compound. It's got those properties that cannot change. Well, it may be that Jesus is talking about the salt in their day, which would have been somewhat impure. It didn't go through the purification process that most of us are familiar with our salt. And so when it's exposed to the elements, that salt, that genuine salt, can leach out, leaving what's left to be useless, leaving just the impurities behind. Others have suggested that he's talking about what Arab bakers at the time would do. They would line their ovens with salt blocks. And under the intense heat, those blocks would, over time, crystallize and undergo a chemical change. They would lose their saltiness. And so they would throw them out and become unserviceable. Well, what he says is the disciple who is unwilling to count the cost, or they don't sufficiently count the cost, so that they no longer remain faithful to Jesus, they no longer stay effective in their commitment to Jesus. Well, the language is pretty strong. In fact, the message just brings it down and says, then that kind of a person is useless. That kind of a person is good for nothing. You see, remaining useful to God means remaining faithful to Him. And that requires counting the cost. Now, it's here that we oftentimes have a difficulty with Jesus' statement here. This is strong language. In fact, as you hear Jesus talk, what does it do to you? You kind of do a self-check with what he says. How does it leave you feeling? How does it challenge your thinking? To be honest, what Jesus says to them is a lot harder for them than it really is for us. Because the choices they had to make were much, much more starkly different than the choices that we have today. Hating family, that was, and being rejected by family, that was a real possibility for them. Giving up self-interest, especially in a world that survival was difficult oftentimes. Taking up your cross, they saw that on a regular basis. Giving up everything, especially in a world that didn't have any social net underneath them. That was really, those dangers, those consequences were very real to them. Now, if you think about it, they're much more real to us than maybe even 50 to 150, 250 years ago, whenever our country was more understood to be more of a Christian nation. We live in a post-Christian time in many ways. And so even for us, these things are becoming more of a real possibility for us, aren't they? But you see, Jesus wanted disciples, not observers. He didn't want just thrill seekers, not people who were just looking for the next meal or the next experience, the next healing, the next salve for their conscience. He didn't want people who were just looking for the next, and you can start filling in the blank, who just wanted to get. To be a disciple means to give. Actually, to give everything. It's not easy. But the accountability to God and the rigor of the task require that we understand the commitment that's required in order to walk successfully as disciples. And Jesus has no choice to hide those requirements from those who want to follow Him. So, where are you at in that? Would you say that you really hate your family comparably to loving Jesus? And what does that look like? What does it look like to hate family today? Well, so many times people choose family over their devotion to Jesus Christ. They may turn a blind eye to godless living within a family because I don't want to make them mad. I don't want to lose the relationship. Well, is that really showing commitment to Jesus Christ first? Or giving priority in activity or in time or in energy or resources to family before first considering how that time or those resources or that energy needs to be spent for Jesus Christ. and let family fit in that commitment. Would you say that you really hate yourself? Now, not in some disparaging, put yourself down kind of way, not a neurotic or a psychological harmful way, but truly hating yourself comparable to how much you love Jesus. Putting self-interest aside. That one may be the one that's a little bit easier for us to grasp. Even over the past year, especially over the past year, where so many have turned inward trying to survive through this pandemic period. Everyone seems to have turned so inward. And so giving up self-interest in order to highlight and bring to the surface the interest of Jesus Christ in my life. Would you say you've come to the point where you willingly and actively face difficulty and rejection for the sake of Jesus? You're willing to bear that cross. And what does that look like today? What does it look like in the workforce? What does it look like in your neighborhood? What does it look like among friends that do not honor Jesus like you do? What does it look like in recreation or entertainment? And if I've come to the place where I truly feel like and understand, I truly have renounced my ownership of things and placed them in the hands of Jesus as my master, as my Savior, for His control. What would that look like today? To give those things up, to not consider those things to be held on too tightly so that Jesus can use them for His glory. This is a difficult passage when you think about it. What Jesus talks about, this calls for discipleship, is not easy. In fact, notice how He finishes this section, His last words to them. He says there at the end of verse 35, whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. I like the way that the Message renders that. It says, are you listening to this? Really listening? Successful discipleship requires Jesus to be the priority in life. And so we must count the cost of following Him if we're going to finish the walk. As our own Mike Wilson said in a lesson one time, he says, unless Jesus means everything to you, He means nothing. So what will you do this week? How will you take some time just to kind of sit back for a moment and reflect and truly count the cost if you've never done that before? Because truly, when you think about discipleship and you think about following Jesus, it is a call to count the cost.